This video is mainly to clear up something from the previous one, the one about toxic empathy. There's definitely something in there I could have been clearer about. No, not my take about right-wingers lacking empathy whenever a lefty is injured or killed, while simultaneously screaming bloody murder when lefties don't have any empathy when a righty is injured or killed. Both sides do actually selectively withhold moral consideration for their political allies only, while shaming their enemies for not applying their moral consideration universally. This is just a fact. If you're crying that I'm both sidesing it, then you just don't want your camp to be called out, and I don't care. And no, not my Ukraine take either. I was completely correct about that too. America or the West didn't start the war. We didn't coup Ukraine in 2014. This idea that Putin is somehow a victim of Western imperialism is retarded. Stop guzzling Russian semen. It's actually this comment that is worth diving into. I'm afraid you're incorrect. Here is something from the study. We also explained to participants that the categories were non-overlapping, such that giving to one category, for example extended family, would not include an inclusive category, for example immediate family. I said in the previous video that when the data was collected for the heat map circles, each circle included all previous circles, and you can see right there in the sheet that that's the case. However, several commenters said I was incorrect. Some of them in fact said I was a liar, because I guess it's not enough that I'm wrong sometimes, I have to be evil too. Those people aren't worth spending any time on. But for those who ask the question in good faith, they do deserve an answer, and I did actually look into it. Another commenter, Flattercats, made a similar claim. He posted the same passage, and also said all participants completed a moral allocation task in which they allocated 100 moral units among the following 16 categories, pictured as increasingly large concentric circles. We can think about people having different amounts of moral units, like currency, that they can spend on others and allocate to different moral circles. Some people devote all of their moral units to one circle, whereas others try to divide up their moral units among multiple circles. So yes, the study is explicitly about what you claim it wasn't about. It does absolutely show what you care about most. Well, okay, fair enough. It's possible I completely messed this up. However, a few other commenters pushed back, saying that I was actually right. So let's get to the bottom of it. Flattercats went back and forth on Twitter on this topic with a friend of mine, Affable. He posted his quote from the procedures part of the study, and she posted her quote from the description of the diagram that became a meme. And at first glance, they do just seem to contradict each other. Affable actually produced an email from one of the authors of the study which says, "We've been getting tons of emails about this. The whole thing is a mess, and it's our fault for our lack of clarity in describing the two different tasks across the main text and the supplementary materials. The heat map was put on arbitrary axes and includes all lower rungs when people select a particular rung. So if people select animals, it includes all categories below it. The moral allocation task is different because we specified that one category does not include another. The heat map does not represent the moral allocation task. It is its own task. There are two tasks presented in 3A, one described in the text and one described in the supplemental." Well, that sounds like a shit show, doesn't it? Apparently, if I'm reading this right, there's actually two sets of data that were collected. One where people allocated 100 units of moral consideration, and the other where people were asked to choose the extent of their sphere of moral concern. The former measures what people care about the most, the latter measures how far their care reaches. The heat map, that viral meme image, the data behind it is, as I said it was in the original video, it is the extent of people's spheres of moral concern. But to be honest, it looks like it should be the allocation of moral consideration, doesn't it? A heat map just makes a lot more sense for the allocation data than the extent data, because it's just more readable that way in my opinion. The action of allocating resources unequally should naturally create a heat map, showing where more or less resources are allocated. Meanwhile, the action of determining the extent of a boundary is useful information, but it's not well presented with a heat map style of graph. So maybe they just fucked up which data set was going to be presented? This article, published on BigThink, explains the meme's current use by the right, and how it's not in line with the actual data of the study. But they also blame the study for not being clear about how the data is presented. And you know what? Fair enough. The conversations all over the internet on this topic make it pretty obvious that a lot of people aren't quite getting it. So let's quickly go over both sets of data. Here's the allocation data. When left-leaning and right-leaning people are given a limited number of moral units to allocate, every group of people except the far left allocate more moral units to the human circles than the non-human ones. The far left allocates slightly more to non-humans. As you move rightward, less moral units are allocated to non-humans and more to humans. The center left and left positions allocate 3 to 4 more units to humans than non-humans. The moderates, center right, and right positions all allocate around 7 more to humans, and the far right looks like 8 or 9 more. when left-leaning and right-leaning people are given an infinite number of moral units to allocate. For all groups, the amount of moral units given to human spheres dramatically increases proportionally to the previous answers. And weirdly enough, the pattern creates an M shape, where the far left and the center both grant less moral units to humans than the center left and the center right, and the far right is actually less than the right. The raw data is actually available for anyone to look at, and Zach Livonian published an article combing over it. Here's what he noticed. In Study 3A, they asked 131 US residents to complete 2 tasks. 1, a zero-sum allocation of moral units across 16 increasingly large categories, and 2, indicating the extent of their moral circle. The first task was described as thinking about your capacity to help, to give, to be charitable, to show empathy, and to be generous. In other words, your capacity to behave morally. We can think about people having different amounts of moral units, like currency, that they can spend on others and allocate to different moral circles. Some devote all of their moral units to one circle, while others try to divide it up among multiple circles. The second task was described as indicating the extent of your moral circle. By moral circle, we mean the circle of people or other entities for which you are concerned about right and wrong being done towards them. This depiction demonstrates that different people have different types of moral circles. At the innermost circle, some people only care about their immediate family, and at the outermost circle, people care about the entire universe. So yes, we actually do have 2 sets of data for Study 3A. The allocation of moral units data, and the extent of the moral circle data. Livonian decided to present this data in ways that made it more obvious what was going on, as opposed to the diagrams in the actual published study. As a box plot, the allocation data shows that there's actually a fair bit more overlap between the human and non-human spheres than the original graphs would have you believe. Real quick, for those of you guys who don't remember high school, box plots show the median as a line within the box, the middle 50% of the data as the box, and the upper and lower 25% of the data as the line extending out of the box. What this shows is that left-leaning people do allocate more moral concern to the non-human spheres than right-leaning people do, but nonetheless, they also allocate just as much moral concern to the human spheres as right-leaning people do. Look at the upper edges of the purple boxes. When it comes to the extent data, Livonian first pointed out that the data was collected by having participants literally click on the circle that represented the extent of their moral consideration. So that kills my previous idea that they just accidentally chose a bad way to graphically present the data. No, this shit show was actually purposeful. He then shows the click map, revealing that while there's a fair bit of overlap in the middle, there is a real difference between the 2 groups. However, Livonian also says that the methodology that was used to create the heat map meme images isn't actually really available, so he tried to recreate them himself using the raw data and the tools he had available. And well, there's still a visible difference, but it's a lot less striking, you know? This image isn't nearly so sensationalistic. And putting this same data onto a line graph shows that while right-leaning people do in fact tend to care more about those circles closer to them than further away, left-leaning people tend to care more than right-leaning people about circles that are further away and circles that are closer to them. In fact, the data says they just care about nearly everything more. The only spot where conservatives slightly win out is when an individual's moral extent doesn't move beyond the immediate family and includes no extended family, no friends, no co-workers, no fellow citizens, nothing. So when a leftoid says that they're just more empathetic and the right-wingers are sociopaths, that is in line with the data. However, that doesn't mean that we should count the right-wing position out. The rightoid critiques this data by saying that in the real world, moral consideration is not actually infinite. You cannot simply care about everyone, the way that, for example, the Slate Star Codex guy insisted that you could. Maybe you can in some abstract intellectual way, but truly care, emotionally, deep down, about all humans, all life? It's just not possible. For example, we all know about Dunbar's number, the cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain relationships with. Basically, the idea is you just can't be close with everyone. There's too many people. You can't have 8 billion friends. You can't be in love with 8 billion individuals. The average that Dunbar came up with was 150. That is the average number of people that any one individual can maintain relationships with. That includes your family, your friends, your classmates, coworkers. Anyone outside of this is a stranger to you, and they will just never be able to have a deep, close connection with you the way that your partner will, because your brain just isn't big enough. This doesn't mean that you can't meet new friends, but if you've ever found yourself, drift out of a friend group before, you realize everyone's acting cold, no one's, texting you back or messaging you, and you're kind of torn up over it. And then 5 years down the road, you have new friends, and you no longer feel a little bit hurt when you think about those old lost friendships. Well, those emotions are gone because your brain can't maintain that many connections, and the old unused ones are just discarded. So when the leftoid says, "We just care more about everyone, you fucking chud," and the rightoid replies, "No you don't, you're just virtue signaling," there's some real truth to that retort. It is actually just impossible for the leftoid to care about everyone. Anyway, Livonian mentioned at the end of his exploration that while the study is interesting, it's clearly only the tip of the iceberg. and he wants to see the idea explored more rigorously, since the sample size consists of the self-reporting of 36 right-wingers and 64 left-wingers, and it fails to answer some important questions. Like, for example, do people assign zero moral concern to those entities that exist outside of the outer bound of their moral circle? Or do they just assign proportionally less? Basically, the study is very incomplete, which is actually a problem considering how widespread it's currently being used. Now, Affable was asked by one of the creators that she got into contact with to not share any of their correspondence, but she remarked that he seemed sad and frustrated at the whole thing. He knows that the study isn't clear and that he fucked up. He knows the internet's latched onto it and is improperly using it, and he seems to find the whole thing taxing and just wants to move on. And you know what? Fair enough, I get it. Let's loop back to the original question. Is the meaning behind the meme real? Do right-wingers actually just prefer those closer to themselves? Their family, their friends, their co-workers, their countrymen, while left-wingers prefer the company of aliens and space rocks? The true, yet unsatisfying answer is, kinda? The left-wing position is that they just care about everything, both near and far, more than the right does. And on paper that's true, ideologically that's true, but we know that emotionally that just can't be true. I wouldn't be surprised if some leftists do actually have a higher Dunbar's number than average, but there is no way it's jumping from 150 to 8 billion. That's just not going to happen. Keep in mind, this data is self-reported, so some left-wing people might just be saying, of course I care deeply about all things, because that answer jives with the ideology, even if it's not actually true in any real way. It's actually much more likely, in my opinion, that the leftist participants in the study have a moral heat map more similar to the rightist ones. They just don't know themselves well enough, or they're answering the questions ideologically or something like this. Which, by the way, is why I pointed out those exceptions at the end of my previous video. You know, where the left-wingers are withholding empathy, while right-wingers are throwing it around freely and shaming you for not having it, both of them doing so on ideological lines. Because there is actually a real problem with this study. Consider the firefighter that was murdered at the Trump rally again. Now imagine a right-wing, pro-Trump person living in Europe, born and raised in Germany or France or something, but he's online all the time. The firefighter would be at Circle 9 in the heat map for him, all people on all continents. He's not his family or friend, they've never met, they're not from the same country. And yet I did actually see right-wing European pundits react to that event publicly as if they were this man's best friend, screaming about how terrible it all was, and how dare you not show outrage. I saw right-wing Canadian pundits do the same, even though for Canadians the firefighter is in Circle 8. And even for most right-wing Americans, he's in Circle 7. He's a fellow citizen. And yet when he was martyred, everyone was giving him this maximum level of moral concern, as if they were all friends with him or something. Because, in a way, they actually were. Political partisanship is a massive wrench that is thrown into this study's data. And intuitively we all know this, right? Think, for example, of some crazy LGBTQ BIPOC left-winger who moves away from their oppressive, stifling hometown and then ends up cutting off their old boomer parents who are still living back there for daring to vote Trump. The people who throw these heat map memes around, they would throw one at this person because what they're saying is that lefty must have this insane out-group bias because they're betraying their own family over politics. The family's like a 1 or 2 on the map. How could this crazy lefty do it? Oh, it's because the heat map shows they have an extreme out-group preference. Okay, fair enough. But the firefighter doesn't occupy a 1 or 2 on almost anyone's map, and yet the right-wingers treated him as if he did. What's actually happening here is that radical devotion to any extremist cause warps the heat map. Friends become enemies, enemies become friends. Your family, normally at 1 or 2, get ejected to the outer edge of the diagram due to political difference. Random strangers who you don't even know are brought into the center as brothers to your cause. And again, we all know this is true. We've all experienced it. We've all seen friendships, relationships fall apart over political differences. And we've all seen partisans and radicals cheer these events on. The parents of that blue-haired lefty don't stop being parents, but they do stop being considered as parents. Meanwhile, the firefighter is a stranger to everyone, and yet for those with right-wing politics, he's brought into the center. And in both cases, the same effect happens. The people for whom an issue is close to their heart, they begin to shame those people for whom the issue is further away from their heart for not having any empathy. The heat map meme is funny and intuitive, and at first glance it says something that we've all seen in a very clever way, which is why it's been propagating. But is it true? Only on a surface level. Actually examining the data immediately makes the entire thing dissolve, because the heat map isn't actually that accurate. And as soon as you realize that leftists don't actually care more about circles further away than them versus circles that are closer, but rather the heat map is just incorrect in how it measures what constitutes closer and further for politically radicalized people, then the entire thing just ceases to make any sense. But at the end of the day, it still makes people laugh, which is probably why it'll stick around.